think there's a balance, right? I think there's some elements of the role in terms of what is the job that stay the same, right? You have to set direction, manage your org, manage your board, all those things. I think that, and it's interesting you said mindsets, because that's really where we went too. I think the mindset or the way of thinking about those aspects of the role is evolving, right? And will continue to evolve.
My guest today is Carolyn Dewar. She is a senior partner at McKinsey Company, where she founded and co-leads their CEO Excellence work. She's also the author of a book called CEO Excellence: The 6 Mindsets That Distinguish the Best Leaders from the Rest. You can imagine why I was so interested to speak with Carolyn, because a lot of her work overlaps with some of the work that I did for my most recent book, The Future Leader, where I also talked about mindsets and skills that current and aspiring leaders need to master if they want to be able to lead in this new world of work that we are all a part of. We actually ended up interviewing some of the same CEOs. In today's discussion, we talk about what we both learned. So some of the things that we explore are what separates great leaders from everyone else. Carolyn will share the 6 mindsets that the world's best leaders practice, and why leadership can be lonely and what to do about it. The bonus episode, which is only available to subscribers of Leading the Future of Work Plus, will look at how to prioritize tasks and information, what leaders need to do to get to the next level, and why it's important to surround yourself with who Carolyn calls truth tellers, and how to actually go about doing that. You won't want to miss that bonus episode. Again, only available to subscribers of Leading the Future of Work Plus. And when you subscribe, you'll get a bonus episode every week, ad-free listening, and early access to new episodes. And of course, I and my team are very, very grateful for you supporters of the show, because it's what allows us to bring in more amazing guests like Carolyn. So I hope you decide to subscribe and support the show. And now let's get right into our discussion. The first, I guess, and the most obvious question is, why did you feel the need to write this book?
Right. Yeah. Well, we have the privilege of talking to lots of different CEOs and counseling them over time. And we kept getting this question about, well, what does a CEO do anyway? And kind of how do I do it well? What are the tips and tricks? And it turns out there's a lot of books written about leadership.
Yeah.
And there's quite a lot of
We've
books
both
about
written one, so
individual CEOs.
we know there's a ton of books out there.
Yeah, exactly. And there's lots of books written about like specific iconic CEOs. You can go and read their biography. But we couldn't find something where people had like looked across all those who'd had that really unique role to say, are there patterns? Are there lessons learned?
Very good. Yeah, and that's exactly the same reason why I wanted to write the book too, because to your point, there are a lot of leadership books out there, but when you read them, you kind of find like 1 or 2 examples. Like everyone talks about Apple, or everyone might talk about a Netflix or a Microsoft, and you have
the same stories.
Exactly, and you have a whole book and all these philosophies and ideas and approaches built on one company in one industry. And when I talk to a lot of leaders, as I'm sure do you, they don't find that to be a very applicable, interesting stories and fun to read, but it's not something that's necessarily applicable to the work that they're doing. So you mentioned kind of this role of CEOs, and one of the things that I found interesting is that a lot of the things that you've researched on CEOs are actually very applicable just to leadership across the board. And before we get into that, do you have a sense of, do you feel that leadership is changing? Like if you were to look back 10, 15, 20 years ago, and you wrote the same book then versus the one that you wrote now, would there be a difference as far as leadership mindsets, approaches to how leaders do things?
Yeah, I think there's a balance, right? I think there's some elements of the role in terms of what is the job that stay the same, right? You have to set direction, manage your org, manage your board, all those things. I think that, and it's interesting you said mindsets, because that's really where we went too. I think the mindset or the way of thinking about those aspects of the role is evolving, right? And will continue to evolve. We tried to anchor on ones that will stand the test of time, but you can feel the relative emphasis of external stakeholders, for example, is one where no CEO can escape that now, right? And so how do you think about what issues to engage in or not, and how, and all of those things? That's new territory.
Yeah, and it's tough. And I don't know if a lot of the leaders you've been interviewing agree with this, but I've talked to quite a few leaders on this podcast who off camera more often than on camera will say that they are unsure how to engage in certain things. Sometimes they get a little scared to talk about stuff because they don't want to be, quote unquote, canceled. And it feels
Yeah,
like
no,
it's,
absolutely. I think the external issues one is one of the
yeah.
biggest changes in the last few years, and it is uncharted. And people are spooked by what happened with Disney in Florida, and they call out these examples. Yet at the same time, employees and increasingly consumers are making their employment decisions or their purchasing decisions based on whether companies are aligned with their values and their way of thinking. So I don't think you can fully go off the hook and say, I'm just going to operate in my four walls and that's my job and that's it. Because employees and buyers now aren't allowing for that. So you can't fully, you've got to have some sort of rubric to decide, right? What will I engage in or not?
Yeah, and I think social media made it particularly tough because now whenever a CEO or any leader for that matter does one wrong thing, it can be picked apart into a million different pieces. I mean, you look at somebody like an Elon Musk, who everybody said he's a great visionary CEO and leader for many, many years for all the companies that he's building. And then he takes over Twitter. And next thing you know, he's vilified and hated, and Tesla shares are plunging, and everybody hates him. But the truth is that a lot of people don't have context around, and I'm not defending him. I don't know what, the inner workings of what's going on in Twitter, but we all know the same thing. And it's kind of what we read online, what we read on social media, the tweets that we see, articles that are written. Whereas you go back 20 years ago, that would have never happened. Like you wouldn't know
They wouldn't
anything.
have had visibility into it.
Yeah, I mean, the only things that you would read, maybe something that you see on TV, maybe something that you read in the paper. But as a CEO, you could probably do a lot of things and it's not going to get picked apart to the way that it is. And if it did, where would it get picked apart? Where you talk to a friend, you see somebody at the water cooler like, oh man, did you see what that, so-and-so did? But today it's like millions of tweets and it's a completely different world. So I think it's a very, very hard time to be a leader. Are you hearing from the CEOs that you work with that they're confused and unsure what to do?
I do think the level of scrutiny is high and people are feeling that, right? I think those, and I'm not sure anyone has it completely figured out on how to navigate, but those who are doing it well do seem to come back to a couple of basics that are giving them a kind of a touchstone for navigating. One is, the purpose of their company. And I don't mean the pretty purpose statement on the wall, but truly, why do we exist in the world? What are we trying to do? And then also who we are, right? Like what are the values of our company? And my personal values as a leader too. What do I stand for and who are we as a company? And when you have those, it gives you a rubric or a filter to say, so here's how we're going to show up in the world. Right? If we're trying to advance this, as part of our reason for being, let me think of an example. Doug Baker at Ecolab, who's someone we talked to, right? He had a cleaning company, a chemicals cleaning company, right? Could easily have been on the wrong side of ESG. Yeah. But they very quickly came to a point around, actually, our purpose in the world is to make the world a cleaner place. So here's how we're going to operationalize that. And here's how that will actually affect what we do, what issues we engage with, how we work internally. And so I do think the scrutiny is high, but part of it is on being congruent between who you say you're trying to be and what you're actually doing. If those two come together, it kind of gives you something defensible.
Do you want to learn how to create an amazing corporate culture while avoiding the pitfalls that make for a toxic one? If so, I created a brand new 8-part training video series just for you. In total, it's around 30 minutes in length, and you can get it right now by going to helpmyculture.com. Go there right now before this training series disappears forever. Again, that is helpmyculture.com and get access to this free 8-part training series on how to create an amazing corporate culture. I mean, I think that's a very fair point. And also, I think kind of the nature, like the relationship of leadership is changing. Like I talked to Frank Blake, the former CEO of the Home Depot, a little while ago, and he told me that one of the things that few leaders understand is that part of their role is to actually give a part of themselves to their people. Like they have to do more, they work harder. That's kind of the role that you take on as being a leader. That's you do more than everybody else. You have more responsibility, more weight on your shoulders. And I think the assumption is that 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, the assumption was the exact opposite, that if you got into a leadership role, it's like, oh, you made it. You got the parking spot, you got the beautiful office, you get the bigger salary, and now you can kind of kick back because, you've made it. You kind of tell everybody what to do. And now it's kind of flipped. And it's like, well, now it's even harder to be a leader. It's not the cushy role anymore. It's the role that you have to work harder than you've ever had to work, and you have more
As
responsibility.
you say, you need to keep all these stakeholders on board.
Yeah.
You need to bring them along. You're almost the convener and the band leader, right? You don't get to just sit back. I think Michael Fisher, who was one of the CEOs we talked to, had this great concept of his to-be list. So lots of CEOs have their to-do list, right, and what they're going to do. But he said, look, the expectation now of a leader, whether you're intentional about it or not, people are going to read into how you're showing up. So what is your to-be list? How are you going to be for your organization? And he takes it really quite tactically, and he prints out his agenda for the day. And next to each thing, he says, okay, I might be, because the channel switching, right? I might be going from a tough regulatory meeting to a town hall with 1,500 people to maybe a customer interview. Who do I need to be in each of those meetings? And it's not about being inauthentic. He's a very authentic guy, but he's very thoughtful that how he shows up has an amplification effect, whether he thinks about it or not. And so, you better not walk down the hall with a grumpy look on your face, or everyone's going to think, oh no, we're having a bad quarter, something bad's happening, right? Like, you need to be on, and that can be exhausting.
Yeah, and I like that who do you want to be list. I think that's a very clever way to think about it. And, to your point, a lot of people turn to leaders, right? So if you show up in a panic and you show up scared, whether you say anything or not, people are going to look at your body language, look at your demeanor, and they're going to draw certain conclusions from it. And I've shared this story on the podcast before, but one CEO that I interviewed told me a story of how they were opening several different headquarters in various locations, and he went to go visit one of them. I think it was in the Bay Area. And he was getting a tour of the facility, and they had art on the wall and stuff like that. And he made a comment, and he said, "Wow, I really like the art here. It looks great." And then he went to another headquarters in Florida, and he did a tour there, and he saw the exact same decorations, exact same art, exact same everything. And he's like, "I'm a little confused here. This is the exact same decoration and art that we had in California, and this is a different space." And they said, "Oh, well, you loved it so much over there that you said you wanted it here." And the CEO said, no, I never said that. I just said that I liked it. So it's one of those situations where things that, you can even imply things as a leader and as a CEO, and people might take that to heart and make decisions based on that. And, it's a tough spot.
Absolutely. You can create unintentionally all sorts of cottage industries, right?
Yeah.
Like if you ask for a report once, suddenly there's a whole team of people who their job every month is to prepare this report that maybe no one will ever look at ever again, right? And I do think that's, being conscious of that and, using your power for good, but being conscious of how, it can spin off and being clear with people, right? Some of the CEOs we talked to would say, hey, just to help you calibrate, I'm looking for the 1 hour answer on this. Or the 1 day answer, or the 1 week analysis, right? But helping people calibrate where your head is, because they all want to show up and do a good job, right? And so they might really overinterpret some of what you're saying.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the research that went into the book, and then we can jump into what some of those mindsets were. So kind of setting the stage, obviously the book looks at mindsets from a lot of the world's top CEOs. What was some of the research and the work that went into figuring these things out?
Absolutely. Well, it started with, we didn't want to just talk to kind of friends and family and aggregate it together. We did want to make sure we talked to CEOs who really had done well. And so as you can imagine, there was a whole analytical exercise around the performance of the companies in their tenure and how we think about that. And we got the list from about 3,000 people who've been CEOs of Fortune 1000 companies in the last 25 years, all the way down to about 200. And really focused on those outperformers. They've been in the top 20% of returns. They'd had good reputation. They'd been in role for at least 6 years. So we actually wanted to make sure people had been in role a while to kind of eat their own cooking, right? Decisions they made early on, they'd had to live with. And so that by itself kind of whittled the list down. And then we had the chance to spend one-on-one time. It was it was at the height of the pandemic. So a little bit of a goodness that came out of that is people had time, they were at home, right? They didn't have their handlers and their speech writers. So we spent about a half day with each of these nearly 70 CEOs, really digging in and saying, what do you wish you'd known? What works for you? What doesn't? What are your lessons learned? And really gather their stories.
That's fascinating. And who were some of the different types of CEOs that you talked to? I think you mentioned Ajay Banga from MasterCard. I think you mentioned Hubert Joly from Best Buy. Who were some of the other names and
Yeah.
companies that people might recognize?
Yeah, for sure. We had Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, um, Microsoft, right? We spent a fair bit of time looking at Microsoft, Mary Barra at GM, Marilyn Houston at Lockheed Martin, and then others in Europe and Asia as well. So the CEO of Adidas, some family run, some privately held, although it's mostly publicly held companies. But yeah, big names that people would recognize, and some real outperformers that you wouldn't recognize, right? Like I said, Doug Baker, some of these other folks that maybe aren't household names, but are doing extraordinary things.
Yeah, one of them I actually reached out to that I found out from you, the CEO of FanDuel. I forgot her name.
Amy.
Yeah. I saw you. I think it was actually fairly recently on LinkedIn. She was
Yeah.
ranked as one of the most transformative CEOs, and you made a comment and said, "Oh man, I love the work that she's doing." And I thought, "Oh, I gotta take a look at this person." So,
Yeah. There's some real innovators out there,
yeah, for
which are
sure.
fun.
Okay, so you spent all this time with these CEOs and did these interviews, and I'm assuming from that you then kind of looked at what some of the patterns were and distilled that into these leadership mindsets. So maybe we can go through each one of these mindsets and perhaps just spend 2 to 3 minutes on each one. The first mindset, I believe, was called direction setting.
Yeah, so each piece we basically said, what is the CEO job anyway? And there's kind of 6 big pieces. And then there was a mindset for each. So the first
Okay.
part of the CEO role is to set direction. But the question we were really diving into is, what's the mindset? How do you think about that? And the mindset that came through in all these interviews for how they set strategy and direction was be bold. Now, to be fair, we probably should have said be bold and be right, right? Because if you're bold and wrong, you wouldn't have hit the performance target. But also, if you aren't bold, you're not going to drive step change outperformance in your company either, right? You can't be incremental. And there was a couple of practical ways that these CEOs acted into this mindset of being bold, right? One is even just setting the bold vision of how we're trying to win, right? What game are we trying to play anyway? I'll pick up on Ajay Banga on this one at MasterCard. When he first started over a decade ago, and they went from 12 billion to 300 billion in market cap. So a huge shift in
Yeah.
his tenure. All of the water cooler chat when he first started was, how do we beat Amex? How do we beat Visa? That's the game they were playing, right? How do we steal market share in credit card? And early days, he and his team stepped back and said at the time, if we can all think back over a decade ago, credit cards were still less than 10% of the world's transactions. And so he, with his team, came out and said, we need to reframe the game. We're not just trying to win market share of this little piece of the pie over here. We're trying to kill cash. That was the reframe they came out with, right? We actually want to go after all of it. What would it look like to really transform how people transact in the world? They went into debit and online and all these other things they weren't doing. So one job of the CEO in being bold is to make sure people are being expansive enough in what game are we playing? How are we trying to win here? Are we over here in a little corner? Another way to make it practical, if I take Mary Barra at General Motors, is as a CEO, you uniquely can allocate resources. And again, these go for any leaders, not just CEOs. And the resource allocation, the boldness with that is not just what you're going to invest in, but what you will say no to. So when Mary took over at GM, they'd been in India as a country for 30 odd years and they had never made money.
Wow,
They'd
I
always
didn't know that.
invested, they thought they should be there, but it had just never made money. It was just sort of this belief of, well, of course we should be there. And her first budget cycle, she kind of said, well, time out. Why are we doing this? We should actually really question it. They ended up withdrawing from the country, which was a very bold move, and she took some real flack. But it was because her vision for where to go around electric vehicles and other things required investment. And they ended up pivoting 50% of their R&D budget to electric vehicles. Like, that's a massive bet,
Yeah.
right? That's bold. But it's really only the CEO or the senior leader that can make those kind of big swings and those courageous moves. Because everyone else, they're trying to optimize and do what they should do. But you need someone sometimes to make those calls. And that's what the boldness looked like in setting direction.
Who defines what boldness means, right? Because, just from listening to this, for example, some leaders out there might say, okay, well, for me to practice this mindset, I guess all I need to do is show up to work tomorrow and say something crazy, and that's bold, and now I'm practicing that mindset, right? So how do you balance first, what are there criteria around boldness, and how do you balance the boldness with something that you mentioned earlier, which is actually being right, achieving something? Because what happens if you're bold and wrong? And what happens if Mary said, I wanted to move to electric vehicles, and that was a complete flop? She was bold, but it ended up being a failure. So what does boldness mean? How do you balance the boldness with the being right piece?
I think that's very fair. And when you were asking about what's changed in leadership, I do think one of the things that's shifting is, gone are the days of the all-knowing CEO who's just going to declare an answer, right? So part of this is the wisdom of engaging your leadership team, external voices, other things to actually shape and come up with a direction together that you think is the right one. And there's some natural puts and takes that come in doing that. I do think, though, it requires a learning mindset that we heard really clearly in all the leaders we talked to. These were not know-it-alls, right? You might think, again, you've gotten to this position, you'd be overly confident. These folks invested real time in learning, right? They prompted folks in their organization many layers down to challenge and to bring ideas. Satya Nadella at Microsoft dedicates a day a month literally to reading and learning on topics that he wants to learn, right? They're meeting people externally. And so it's not just some big declaration up front of boldness, but even over time, as you're starting to invest and do things as a company, is it working? Is it not? Do we need to pivot? What have we learned? How do we experiment? Right? So this constant learning cycle, I think, as you're navigating your way to that vision, so that you're not just, blinkers on and kind of following something that isn't relevant anymore.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So the boldness then, I guess, is a way to think about it is it's, I guess, something that seems a little bit radical or different from the current trajectory of the business that requires some sort of a major shift or pivot in direction.
I mean, usually it's a major pivot, right? We have had leaders say, well, before I made CEO, I was part of the leadership team that created our direction. I agree with it. Do I really need to change? You don't want to blow everything up just for the sake of it, right?
Yeah.
But you do need to have a clear vision of where you're going and what that looks like and how you're going to get there.
Okay.
So you don't, it's not change for change's sake.
Okay. Got it.
That's a good clarification.
And then the next mindset. Well, I guess one last thing to touch on, kind of the boldness piece. What happens if you are wrong? Because I'm sure not every CEO that you interviewed with a bold vision ended up, not everything ended up perfect. If you're bold and you're wrong, does that negate the bold factor, or is it about looking at what you've learned from the mistake that you've made?
I think there's both. I think if you're bold and colossally wrong and you continue and you don't change, eventually you're not going to be the CEO anymore, right? And that's kind of the job of the board. But I do think it comes back to this sort of learning mindset and being open that even if you declare something and you try it, if it's not working, are you willing to pivot? Are you willing to admit it maybe didn't work or adjust how you're doing it or change? And we certainly heard that. One leader in Latin America we talked to was driving a huge M&A deal. It was going to be industry transforming. And right at the last minute, they changed their mind. And at that point, it actually takes more courage to change your mind than not, right? It's maybe a bizarre analogy, but it's almost like it's your wedding. Right? The church is full, everyone's flown in, you decide it was a bad idea. At that point, it actually takes more courage not to go through with it.
Yeah.
Right? And we did hear leaders talk about the courage of sometimes saying, you know what? We're not doing it and let's cut our losses. And that's boldness itself.
Definitely. Okay, let's jump to the next mindset. I think it was around org alignment.
Yeah, so the next part of the job is to align your org, right? And so the mindset that CEOs had was they treated the the so-called soft stuff, right? Talent, culture, org, as if it was the hard stuff. They took it really seriously.
Oh.
And these CEOs really spent real time on culture, talent, org design, making sure it was working. It wasn't outsourced to HR. It wasn't a fluffy thing. And so to make it practical, on the culture side, often there was even just one or two cultural shifts that they knew were important to driving business success. And they weren't nice to haves, right? Too often with things like cultural change, we put it in a best efforts basis bucket, right? You would never do that with an operational initiative or a strategic initiative. So these CEOs knew what change they were trying to drive. They knew how they were going to measure it. They had real initiatives against it. They were holding leaders accountable for it, right? Again, Satya Nadella at Microsoft, a huge shift towards growth mindset. He's been working on that personally for 5 years. He's kind of sick of talking about it, but he knows it takes that long to drive the shift, and he spends real time doing it, right? A move towards more diversity and inclusion is a shift we hear a lot about. Again, that's not something that's best efforts basis. If you're going to do it, you do it right, and you treat it like an important initiative. And so these CEOs were spending real time on this, quote, kind of soft stuff.
I really like that you mentioned it doesn't get outsourced to HR, because that's actually what happens in a lot of companies, right? Is culture, talent, hiring, firing. It's like, HR, do it and then report back to me on what you find. But it seems like in this case, the CEO was the evangelist, the champion, really helping spearhead a lot of these initiatives, and then using HR as a way to support that, not as a way to drive it, which I think is a very different and unique way to think about making change inside of an organization.
Absolutely. And the same
Did
was true on talent, right? There's been a lot of talk of war for
Okay.
talent. These CEOs knew what were the pockets, not of the usual people, not names, but what were the pockets of talent and roles that we had to have great players, right? We need a great digital team. We need a great person in
Yeah.
this role because it will drive our strategy. And then they made sure they had good people in them. But they had a really strategic
Mm.
view of where they needed to have excellent talent.
Okay. Speaking of the soft stuff, selfishly, I have to ask, since I'm working on a new
Yeah.
book on this topic around leadership and vulnerability. Did that come up at all? Did any of the CEOs mention vulnerability or humility or anything related to that during your conversations?
They did. And I'd actually love to hear too how you're thinking about vulnerability. I think it came up in a few ways. One was there is a humanizing of the role. And I think actually the pandemic and remote work also shifted that, where people weren't as scripted. They were at home, their dogs were barking, they had access to be. So I think becoming just more human and a little bit less fully armor up, right, all the time, I think is part of
Mm.
that vulnerability. I think the humility piece definitely came up and was key and was linked a lot to this learning mindset, right? But a lot of the CEOs talked about how they were very conscious that it wasn't. Don't get sort of confused that it's about you, right? You're there to sit in a seat and to be sort of a guardian of an organization, to leave it better than you found it, right?
Mm.
And so don't get overly enamored with the invites to Davos and the
Mm.
this and the that, thinking that it's all about, it's not. You're there because of the seat you're taking, right? And the role you're playing. And so with that comes real responsibility, right? And this whole notion of, your jokes get a lot funnier, right? When you suddenly become a senior leader. And so realizing that you don't want to be in an ivory tower where everyone's just telling you what you want to hear, right? You need to create an environment where you are humble, you're open to ideas, and you realize that, yeah, you're not kind of the king or queen in the castle.
Speaking of the
But I'd love to hear what your research on that. Yeah.
Yes, I guess two things. On the vulnerability front, and I won't spoil too much. My book is coming out in, I think,
Yeah.
October of this year. So I still have like 9 months.
That's
And I'm
exciting.
actually just combing through some of the findings. I interviewed over 100 CEOs. We surveyed around 14,000 employees. And so there's a lot of really, really cool stuff emerging. But I think one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough for leaders when it comes to vulnerability is the role that competence plays. And so, I think there's been this really big assumption in the business and in the leadership role that vulnerability on its own is good. Show up to work, admit mistakes, talk about things that you don't know how to do, and this and that, and that's totally fine. But I think the truth is that if you are vulnerable and you don't have some degree of competence, then vulnerability from a leadership perspective can actually hurt you. If you just show up to work each day asking for help, admitting to mistakes, talking about things that you don't know how to do, eventually somebody's going to start to question, why are you in that role? So at a certain point, you
Interesting.
need to have that level of
Balance.
competence. Yeah, vulnerability with competence is a
Yeah.
very powerful combination for, and I'm talking specifically for leaders. Like if you're not in a leadership role, it's
Yeah.
not as relevant. But for a leader, vulnerability without competence can be a very, very scary thing. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people forget. I think for leaders, vulnerability is a huge, huge asset. But I also believe that there is a right way and a wrong way to be vulnerable. I think there's and that's part
Mhm.
of what I'm exploring and what I'm going to be creating. I think there's a framework, an approach for leaders that allows vulnerability to be used as a superpower as opposed to something that can be negative. And I know that one of the things that a lot of people are scared of is I don't want to be vulnerable at work because I don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent, right? That's, one of the number one fears that people have. So for leaders,
Yeah.
I'm a big advocate of vulnerability, but I do also believe that the competence piece is important. And the way that I like to think about vulnerability is different than being a vulnerable leader is vulnerability is about showing up to work and saying, I need help. I made a mistake.
Mhm.
A vulnerable leader says, I made a mistake. Here's what I'm going to do to fix it. I don't know how to do this. Here's what I'm going to do to figure it out. So there's that leadership piece, right? There's the vulnerability piece and the leadership piece, and you need to have both,
Mm.
right? And I
I
think
love that.
that's, yeah, and that's I think where a lot of the conversation doesn't play. And so I'm
Yeah.
hoping to,
I know Brene Brown has talked a bit about like the vulnerability, the shadow side too of oversharing, right? You're right.
yep,
It can go wrong. It's not an excuse to just throw up your hands and say, we're screwed. I don't know what to do either, right? That's not leadership. I love that tension you're setting up.
yeah, and look, vulnerability will go wrong at some point. I did kind of an informal poll on LinkedIn from 1,000 people and from lots of others, and I asked people, have you ever been vulnerable at work and had it used against you in some way? And most people say yes, but at the same time, it's not that different than anything else in life, right? I mean, you will be
Yeah.
told no. You'll get turned down for a job. You'll get turned down on a date. You'll have a friend upset you. That's part of life. You can't expect that literally every time you will be vulnerable, you will reach a desired outcome. And I
Yeah.
think people assume that, oh, I'm vulnerable and everything's going to be great. And then if something bad happens, I'm never going to be vulnerable again. That's not the right way
Right.
to approach it.
Right.
Right? It's like if
That's
you take
fair.
a chance or you take a risk on something and it doesn't go well, and as a leader you say, "Well, I'm never going to be innovative again. I'm never going to think outside the box again." I mean, that's just it's for lack of a better word, a stupid way to think about leadership.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there is, I think, a lot of power in vulnerability, but again, I think it needs to be done the right way. And I forgot what the second part of your question was that we were talking about. I can't remember. Org alignment.
Oh, you're done. Culture and talent.
Yeah, I can't remember. It'll pop into my mind. I'm sure at some point
Yeah.
it'll fly in there. So the next mindset, so after org alignment, another crucial aspect is around mobilizing leaders. And so what's the relevant
Yeah.
mindset for that?
So and this is largely about your top team, right? Your leadership team. And there's a real link to vulnerability. The mindset is around managing, they manage the psychology of the team,
Yeah.
right? So it wasn't just what are our agendas, who's on the team, but a real recognition that, especially as a CEO or senior leader, you have to get leverage. You have to have alignment and effectiveness of that team underneath you because they're the ones who have to scale and drive this in the organization. And so most of your work is working through leaders. And so how do you think about the psychology of working through that leadership team, both getting them working well together as a unit and individually? And that's a real shift for some leaders, right? Going from being the one doing it to the one trying to do it through others. And what does that? And it requires some vulnerability from you and from your other members of your leadership team, but also some real thoughts around what is the work that we need to get done as a team? What's the work only we can do? How do we need to work together? How will we make decisions productively? What's the stuff that I'm going to go away and do in my piece versus where I need to interact with others? And really being intentional about almost that operating system. Someone described it as like it's like your Intel Inside, your operating system at the top of the house of how you're going to manage this beast, this organization underneath all of you.
Mm,
What data do you need to look at to make fact-based decisions? Who gets to opine on them? All of that
yeah.
stuff.
Yep.
And a lot of the CEOs we talk to spend almost a third of their time really getting that team functioning well, because once they've got it, it just gives them so much to be able to handle all the other parts of the role.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm always fascinated by, and it's sort of like this weird. It's almost like when you become a leader, you get taken out of the matrix, right? Because when you first start in any kind of role, and you probably even experienced this in your career, I know I certainly have. But if you think about some of the first jobs that you've ever had, you very much focus on the task or the project or kind of what you're doing. It's not really focused on the people. It's you're an individual contributor. Your first
Yeah.
weeks or months on the job, and I was like, how do I do X, Y, Z? In a great way. And then after you get promoted, your shift, you move away from the task and the project to how do I help these people get X, Y, Z done the best way. And
Right.
that's when you start to
Yeah.
realize the power of things like vulnerability and connecting with people and understanding your employees as human beings and not just as workers, and empathy and like all this human stuff. But as an
Yes.
individual contributor, as an employee, you don't necessarily have a necessity for that, or you're not exposed to that because you're just working on your PowerPoints all day. You're combing through reports
Yeah.
all day. You're helping other people. So it's really interesting at a certain point for people to make that shift. And I always wonder what happens if we could make that shift when an employee first starts working at the company. Like from day one, can they think about the human stuff first instead of just the task? And I think that'd be pretty interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And even the task they're working on, how will this task actually help the person that I'm making this
Yeah.
PowerPoint for? Is it achieving that end, right? Because that's one of the pieces of these leadership roles is you're seeing that bigger picture all the time, right? And so the sooner you can elevate and see that slightly bigger picture, whatever your role, I think the better for everyone.
Yep. Yep. Okay, so mobilizing leaders. And then just so you know, I think the last 10, 15 minutes or so, I think we'll talk about specific action items for leaders to implement. But we have another maybe like 6 minutes before we get to that. So the next
Okay.
one, board
Okay.
engagement. And this is unique because
Yeah.
it's not, probably a lot of people listening to this will not be engaging with a board. But when I was thinking about this, I also thought that even if you're a mid-level leader, you can kind of think of your senior level leaders as your board. Or if you're an individual contributor, you can kind of think as
Absolutely.
your manager and your leader as your board. So there's a lot of relevance here. So let's talk a little bit about
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. It's sort of whoever is that stakeholder group, maybe
Yeah.
just one level up, or maybe it's even peers that they're not directly in your team, but you need to work with them to get it done.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Because the mindset on this one was probably the most different between these high performing leaders and the average mindset. So the average mindset around boards is sort of something to be tolerated, right? And you can imagine this of whatever stakeholder group you have internally,
It's
right?
like your
You
it's like
give
your
them the
HR
reports
team,
they
right? You just
need,
got to
you get
tolerate them.
yeah, you get through the monthly meeting and you get to go back to running you're doing your day job, right? That's sort of the typical. This mindset was different. They really said, how do I help, in this case, my board directors, help me and help my business? But you can imagine substituting that in for how do I help my leadership team? Or if I'm a country manager, how do I help have head office genuinely be helpful to me? What would I do differently?
Yeah.
You would actually share more. You would make sure they had the context and knew enough information so that they could be informed in the input they're giving, right? You would bring them along on the journey and the vision of where you're trying to take things, and what you'd probably be open about challenges that you're having a little bit earlier so they can help, as opposed to saying everything's great until it's not,
Hmm.
right? Someone used the expression, those red, yellow, green stoplight charts of
Yep.
trackers
Yep. Yep.
that one of my clients call it a watermelon. It's green until it's red, right? It's like you would actually be much more open. Hubert Joly at Best Buy talked about kind of radical transparency with his
Mm,
board. I mean, that takes a lot of confidence to
yeah.
be that way with your leadership team or whoever your stakeholder group is. But if you really want them to be able to be helpful to you, what would you be doing differently? And maybe it's your peer group that you need to convince. Would you be like this, hiding everything and kind of you'd probably be a bit more open. And so practicing what that looks like, I think, is a real shift for a lot of people.
Remember to go to helpmyculture.com if you want to get access to my brand new 8-part completely free training series on how to create an amazing corporate culture while avoiding the pitfalls that make for a toxic one. Not only will you hear from me, but you will hear from best-selling authors including Daniel Coyle, who wrote The Culture Code, and Aaron Meyer, the best-selling author of The Culture Map and No Rules Rules. You will also hear from Mark Randolph, the first CEO of Netflix, and Jim Heppelman, the CEO of PTC. Again, you can get access to all of this completely free by going to helpmyculture.com. I hope you find the video training series useful. All right, let's see if we can get through the last two in the next 5 minutes or so. Next one, stakeholder connection, and then we have personal effectiveness. So let's start with stakeholder connection.
Stakeholder we kind of hit on earlier, right? This is all the external stakeholders, and just this notion of start with the why. So as you're thinking about what issues should I engage on, who should I engage with or not, having this sense of purpose and values of why does your organization exist, and using that as your rubric for, is this something I should get involved in or not, is sort of the shorthand answer on the stakeholder one. I know we talked about that earlier.
Yeah, and what if you're
the last one in terms of...
So what if you're not a CEO thinking about why does my organization exist? What if you're maybe a mid-level leader? Is it still the same approach and the same mindset that you need to have as far as thinking about the organization, or do you have more of like your personal values and why am I here at this company kind of come into play?
I think both. I do think being grounded in the company sense of why, wherever you are in the organization, is really helpful. And if it's not a conversation you're having, it's a good one to prompt, right? A lot of companies, especially in the last few years, have talked about their purpose and what that looks like, and making sure it isn't just kind of the pretty poster on the wall.
Yeah.
Maybe have the discussion with your team or with your boss on, well, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for our part of the organization? How do we contribute to that? It's not only a productive conversation, it's usually pretty motivating, right? And kind of a fun and nice one to have around, let's remind ourselves why we're doing all this. And you can also raise it when a tricky issue comes up. So maybe a regulator is asking you something or a customer is asking for something and you're not sure if you should do it or not. It's a good question to ask in your team meeting. Like, let's reground ourselves in our purpose. Is this in line with who we're trying to be? Is this not? Right? And using it actively as a discussion as opposed to just kind of a one-off.
Okay, got it. And the last one, personal effectiveness, which I think is also very crucial. So what's the mindset here?
The mindset here is do only what you can do, right? And this is because so many of these roles just have unending demands, right? You could fill your day 24/7. Any of us could in lots of our jobs, right? And so are you really clear on what's the work that's most value added that you can contribute? And are you focusing on that? And at the same time, especially if you're in other parts of the org, if there is a report you're producing and you know full well no one's ever reading it, that's actually a good thing to raise. It takes a little bit of courage because you might be worried it does you out of a job. But this notion of, is the work you're doing the highest value add work it can be? Are you spending your time on the right things? If you're finding yourself in endless meetings where you don't say a word and when you're one of 30 people, is that something to challenge? I think I saw yesterday in the news, Spotify has made a rule now where they're like canceling half their meetings in their calendars. I mean, that's about being thoughtful about our time and our energy so that you can focus on the things that make the biggest difference. It'll help all of us.
So personal effectiveness, and maybe, so I guess the way to think about that if you're a leader is, am I having the impact that I need to be having on my team or my company? And if not, what is keeping me from achieving that impact that I need to be having?
Yes, I think that's right. Everything from the overall mindset, but also the very practical, right? Do you look back at your calendar from the last month and say, did I spend time on the things that actually were important? Or did it get it sucked into a bunch of rabbit holes?
Yeah. So
and if I did, how am I going to stop that?
So it requires a little bit of self-reflection and time and kind of looking at stuff, which a lot of leaders, sometimes have a hard time doing because they're just running from one place to the next, putting out one fire. It's hard. And I know great leaders do this, but leaders that struggle, one of the things I think they need to do a better job of is to take a step back and just review, what did my week look like, my day, my month, Was I burned out the entire time? Why? Like, what did I get excited about over the past week? Did I learn something new? And asking those questions on a regular basis, I think will really lead to some pretty good results.
Absolutely.
Hopefully. My conversation with Carolyn Dewar continues for subscribers of Leading the Future of Work Plus, and in this bonus episode, Carolyn talks about how to prioritize tasks and information, what leaders need to do to get to the next level, and why it's so important to surround yourself with truth tellers. Again, only available to subscribers. It's only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year. And as a subscriber, you will get a bonus episode every single week, ad-free listening, and early access to new episodes. And of course, you get a chance to support the show, which is what allows me to bring in more amazing guests that you and I and everybody else can learn from. So I hope you decide to subscribe and support the show, and I'll see you next week.